Welcome everyone. My name is Anna Kirikova. I'm head of international projects for the Manifesto Central Exhibition Hall in St. Petersburg, Russia. And I'm honored and delighted to welcome you to the launch of the Manage new international initiative, New Now. New Now is an online platform tailored specially for the present moment and for doing investigation into this present moment and creating together our shared future. This is, of course, not an easy task. Therefore, we are going to do this with the help of some of the most preeminent thinkers of our time. These are philosophers, authors, cultural thinkers, anthropologists, curators, museum directors, and many more. So briefly on the New Now. We are going to explore the present moment through 8 thematic modules. These include eco-agenda, mental health, transhumanism and existential risks to humanity, body and identity, technology and the limits of freedom, the concept of reality, the concept of truth, and many more to come. All this is going to be published and is already online at www.newnow.com. And I'm happy to launch the first session, the first discussion of the program. And the theme for this discussion is Neomythologies and the problem of the disintegration of reality. This is probably going to be one of the most theoretical, if you like, discussion of the series, but I find it I find it a perfect means to actually start the discussions on our contemporaneity and all of its contradictions, because we think that it is exactly contemporary myth-making or myth-thinking that are probably able to cope with the current dramatic transformations of our reality. So it is my pleasure to welcome our speakers today. A philosopher and writer, Federico Campagna, joining us from London. Hello, Federico. Federico's recent books are Prophetic Culture, Technique and Magic, the Reconstruction of Reality, and The Last Night. Federico works as a lecturer in philosophy at the University of Visual Arts in The Hague, and also works as rights director at Verso Books. This is a publishing house in London, I guess. So once again, hello, Federico. Also from London, publisher at Shin. Hello, sir. Great to have you with us. Is among the co-founders of Silver Press, that is a feminist publisher, and Ignota Books, an experimental platform exploring technology, myth-making, and magic. Sarah is also the founder of the New Sons, a curation and storytelling platform, which began as a literary festival at the Barbican Center and includes projects at other cultural institutions in London and beyond. And also today with us, philosopher and writer Reza Negarestani, joining us from Connecticut in the United States. Hello, Reza. Great to have you with us. Since the early 2000s, Reza has contributed extensively to various journals and anthologies, and lectured at numerous international universities and institutes. So his writings have been translated into more than 12 languages, that includes Russian. Reza's latest philosophical work is called Intelligence and Spirit, and it is an inquiry the meaning of intelligence at the intersection of artificial intelligence, philosophy of mind, theory of computation, and the philosophy of German idealism. And of course, as you all know, Reza is also an author of the legendary text Cyclonopedia. Thank you very much, Reza, for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you. Thank you. And finally, I would like to present our event moderator, Alexander Vileikis. Hello, Alexander. Alexander is joining us from Yekaterinburg. That is a city in Russia. So Alexander is a Russian philosopher and social science researcher, and he's going to moderate our discussion today. Before we start, I would like also to say a huge thank you to the partners of the New Now program for their generous support, and we couldn't have done it without you. These are the Cultural and Education Center of the British Embassy in Moscow and the Mikhail Bajanov Foundation in St. Petersburg. Thank you very much. And so welcome everyone. And now over to Alexander.
Thank you, Anna. Good evening, dear ladies and gentlemen. Today we begin the first meeting of the New Now program. My name is Alexander Vileikis, and I will be today's moderator. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers, the team of St. Petersburg Manifesto, for creating such a large-scale lecture program, which we're opening now and which will be continued during this fall, winter, and probably spring. And thank you to our speakers, Reza, Federico, and Tara, for being able to join us this evening, and you, dear listeners, for being us today. Now I will give a short introduction, and we will move on to short speeches for our speakers. First of all, which I want to say today, it's about the Industrial Revolution that actually marked the victory of Western rationality. Domestic magic, everyday life mythology, and some of other forms of enchantment of the world and witchcraft were displaced from most people's everyday life in favor of rational regulation and other practice by techniques, by mythologies, by technologies, by some kind of social engineering. Max Weber, the German sociologist, spoke of the need to disenchant the world. It was his thesis from the Science as a Valor, his work in the early of 20th century. Emile Durkheim, his French colleague, argued that the replacement of old rituals was not by the victory of rationalization of the world, but the change rituals from old one to news. A century later, nowadays, we see that everyday magic and other forms of mythology are still exist in our daily lives, and European rationality has not victoried, had not triumphed by actually changed in the forms of modern myths. Beliefs, cosmogony, myth, and everyday magic now woven into bizarre hybrids along with advances in science and technology, forming a new cultural layers that will remain of our generation in future. Importantly, if we're speaking about the Western rationality, we should understand that it's not only one form of rationality that actually exists in nowadays worlds, because we have like lots of other world images and myths that lived in other societies and our cultures that have very different and very interesting ways of myth-making, of cosmogony, and their myths actually may say a lot about us and say a lot about our future and our past. Third important element of myth-making is myth as a radical way of thinking. Myth gives us opportunity to think that some conceptions that we actually cannot think in our everyday life because they are too radical, too strange, too provocative, and probably too good to live in our modern world. That's why myth and cosmogonies can become effective tools for promoting for a new ecological agenda, gender equality, reducing economic inequality, and so on and so forth. It's actually a mistake to think that myth as a way of thinking was used only in Neil Gaiman's work, American Gods. Actually, there are lots of contemporary science, philosophy, and art beneath it. And so today we will speak about the ways of myth-making in modern world. And my introduction is over, and I pass the floor to Federico for the first speech from our speakers from his introduce.
Hello, hey. So my brief introduction will be just about one possible interpretation of what myths are, in the sense of where they come from. There is an impression nowadays that when we talk about myths, we talk about fantasies or psychological symptoms. So things that come from the inside to a certain extent, that we create. If we look at the ancient understanding of myths, it is suggested that the myths come from the outside. So that the myths do not come from our imagination, but our imagination catches something that is already in the world, in the objects themselves. So the idea is that there is something in reality itself that speaks mythically. In fact, mythos means tale, but mythology is the tale of the tale. So when you retell the tale that comes from the world. The point here is ontological, in the sense that there is something in the ancient mythological understanding. It says that there is something in reality itself which contains a mythical quality. It's a bit like if you think of mathematics. Mathematics, you wouldn't say that it is a fantasy or a psychological symptom. You would say that there is something in the appearance of reality itself that speaks to us mathematically. And with our mathematics, we do the mathematical logos. We talk about it. Now, what kind of part of reality is caught by the myth? Is a particular aspect of reality in which there is an interpenetration between the ineffable and the speakable, the rational and the irrational, the visible and the invisible, time and eternity. It is this mash, this interpenetration that speaks to us mythically and we catch. And it speaks to us in the form of a disfigurement, the disfigurement of the world with the unworldly, of the unworldly with the world, of time with eternity, and vice versa. When we speak about these things mythically, and when I say we, I mean mostly the ancients, we usually speak anthropomorphically. So that's the funny aspect of myths. Why do they speak anthropomorphically? And this is an important aspect of mythology that doesn't take away the value of it, but actually adds to it. The point is that a myth, a mythology, so a discourse over the mythical aspect of reality, is not an attempt to say what happens in the world in the way in which we understand facts and events as normal, actual events, facts that can be caught by language completely. But about things that Sallustius, the friend of Julian the Apostate, said, things that never happened, yet they are always. In this sense, we speak anthropomorphically because, first of all, according to ancient epistemology, only like knows like. So to speak with humans, you have to give them a human form. To speak with animals, you have to give it an animal form. The old idea that if horses could write, they would write their own mythology about horses' gods. But also because by looking implausible, by looking anthropomorphic, they remind us that these events don't fall into the history of what actually happened, but fall into a meta-history, so in a beyond history that is intermashed with history in an impossible way. When we think about myth-making today, often my impression is that the ontological substratum is missing. What is missing is the very understanding of reality as a multidimensional realm in which language catches only one part. Then there is another part which is interpenetrated and speaks mythically, and then there is another part which is entirely invisible. Since we lack this understanding, we understand reality as entirely linguistic. When we speak about myths nowadays, we usually speak about fantasies, which is a completely different thing. Fantastical imaginations or psychological symptoms, which is another way. Perhaps the closest thing that comes to mythology today is scientific language, in a sense. However, in the way in which it is treated most commonly, it fails to qualify as mythological truly, because it lacks the anthropomorphic part, in that it speaks objectively about things that truly are, that actually really are, and it substitutes itself as a language to the object which it speaks about. It's not disfigured, it's not funny, it doesn't remind you that it's not the whole of the truth. And in substituting itself to reality, a language that substitutes itself is a language that stands over something, superstition, superstare, to stand over something. Scientific language, unfortunately, ends up speaking superstitiously, not because of the content of what it says, but because of the style of how it says it and how it presents itself. So my initial contribution would be about the origin of myths and the qualification of mythology and its anthropomorphic form.
Sorry. Thank you, Federica. Now I will turn the floor to Sarah and your introduction.
Thanks for having me. And thanks, Federico. So basically, I'm interested in mythology and myth-making in relation to the role of narrative in the ways that we inhabit the world, in which there's not one thing nor two things, but 10,000 things, as the Taoists might say. And maybe similarly to what Federico was saying, I guess this narrative and mythology is a means by which we can have an active encounter with the world. And so I'm also interested in how this can be connected to healing, which is not an end in itself, but a process of making whole. Le Guin said that narrative is a stratagem of mortality. It is a means, a way of living. And I see a connection there. So a long time ago, mythology was the narrative form that held these 10,000 things in meaningful connection, including the things that are invisible or irrational and uncategorizable by giving them a name or a place, at least in the stories. But as we've said, nowadays, myths are often used to describe that which isn't real, things which are false. And I think that this shift in meaning arises in the same place where there's a break, where the imaginal is severed from the material and the sacred from the mundane, and our feelings and our thoughts, our feelings and our bodies from our thoughts. I think that this break is a collective trauma, which also creates gaps in ourselves. You could call this sickness of the soul, which is visible in the mental health pandemic, which we are living through at the same time as the coronavirus. Since language is thought incarnate, mythology is soul incarnate in the formulation of someone called Hubert Bancroft. I'd say that an example of this kind of dissociation can be seen in the character Kay in Kafka's unfinished novel, The Castle, where Kay keeps trying to telephone the castle in this dreamlike story of endless disconnection from this other higher place. And I think that healing, repairing this break, means not separating myth and reality out from each other, but approaching the mythic in a way that involves throwing off this positivist recasting of myth as something unreal, or otherwise intellectualizing and sealing myth off in a purely imaginal realm. So living mythically is not fantasying and not mistaking fantasying for acting, but recognizing that we need a reality that allows the myth to fall in. And at the same time, when we talk about the mythic, there should be room for connecting with the body and the social, since myths have existed for both survival and for expression, and they were shared orally and always in relation. So in all, there should be room to hold not one or two, but 10,000 things, some of which are incommensurate and formless and coming into being and already felt like poetry. Thank you.
Thank you. And now, Reza, your introduction.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, everyone. Federico, Sarah. So my position with regard to myth is that I think that the theory of creating myth-making is quite under explained, not in the sense of what are its origins, but actually what its functions are, what sort of concepts of myth we are throwing around, and so on and so forth. I think that I can go along with some of my interlocutors by saying that, yes, I agree with what you are saying with regard to the function of the myth, but then we have to calibrate the notion, the concept of myth at that point. In fact, this is going to be, the precisely what makes me a kind of a skeptic about the themes, the overall themes of this event, as long as they are not distinguished properly. First of all, I would say that, regardless of what we are talking about, I would say that modernity's fight against myth as a protological edifice was most probably under-equipped in understanding what it means for something to be protological, right? But nevertheless, modernity's assault on mythological world was completely justified, in the sense that we have two different ideas of myth. Myth as derived from symbolic form, and myth as a vehicle of ideological mobilization, dogmas, superstition, so on and so forth, namely recourse to a primordial world where there is no, where basically politics and rudimentary imaginative forces collide and become one. And we have seen it in terms of Aryanistic mythology. So I would say that modernity is not a world to be forgotten or left behind in its entirety. Why? Precisely because it is a world, and every world will in part subsist in a new world. For the elements or ingredients of a world are not exactly equivalent to the world which is to be replaced. Worlds as complete totalizations are ill-conceived. They don't exist. The transition from a totalized world vision to a detotalized one is often violent, as it entails the unmaking or destruction of the existing world on behalf of a new world. Yet new worlds do not arise ex nihilo. They always are revisions and recognitions or versions of what has come before, which is called the so-called old world, or a world in the process of unraveling. Within the cognitive constructive task that we are talking about here, which is called world making, we cannot think of modernity as a world that can be merely replaced by a reintroduction of new narratives of enchantments and ancient myths and narratives of anti-modernity. That vision of our world belongs to a version of the world that belongs to those who think that the only way out of the older world is by supplanting it with something thoroughly new, to unseat its ethos with an entirely different one, as in replacing disenchantment with enchantment, its positive and negative alienating forces of modernity with myths of a world indiscriminately antagonistic to alienation, technology in all their shapes, but a world that ought to be reassembled from the ruins of modernity can never be an enchanting one at this point. For the thoroughgoing critique of modernity, if we are actually talking about what it means to survive after modernity, to criticize and become concretely conscious of its debacles and tribulations, that sort of task is predicated on an advance in the critical field of modernity itself, whereby the exploitations and failures of modernity are exposed not by a recourse towards a pre-critical framework such as magic and protological worldviews, but by resorting to a critical framework born out of modernity itself. It is the critical ethos of modernity understood as a cognizing and recognizing task at once that endures within a world made and remade anew. The notion of myth at this point can and should only capture the cognitive recognitive labor of modernity, whose final goal is a disenchantment of all worlds, itself included, on behalf of an infinite deracination and drift, a labor which is the collective exploration of reason's overcoming of its own self-imposed limitations and obstacles, and which represents fundamental meaning of history through the nature of the human, through which the nature of the human is being concretely determined. To move toward such a new, basically, to reinvent the idea of myth, postmodernity in a Lyotarian rational sense, entails to renegotiate the very nature of myth. And to leave the idea of myth, as clunky as it was, simply as a collective subconscious, simply the symptom of symbolic forms, a la Kazirer, even though I have a great respect for Kazirer on this point, is to go to a square one, go back to a square one. This, I would say, the notion of myth, remythologizing a world according to the disenchanted world in which we are inhabiting and only from which we can make a solution for ourselves, is tantamount to a notion of progress, which is no longer completely abiding by the concept of the human. Precisely because the concept of human was never given to us in advance. So that sort of the conjunction of a concept of humanity that its totality has not been in advance to us. Its nature has not been all given in advance to us. And this notion of progress, which is simply the exploration of the limitations of the concept of humanity, constitute the very nature of history. And any sort of myth-making should go through this sort of hard, laborious tribulation. Otherwise, it would be just lip service to the sort of dogmas, pre-critical dogmas that we should grow out of them. And we haven't yet.
Thank you, Reza. Now, before we start from our first topic to discussion, I want to notice to our dear audience that your questions you may ask below the window with actual stream. So if you have question, you may ask it in Russian or in English. So our first big topic after this short presentation of three different view of how myth-making actually works, which functions do it have, and what will be the myth and the manifesto. Actually, how do myth-making and the imagination allow us to create radical concepts for transforming the world into a better place to live? Where is this function of myth of today, of modern myth, to recreate this world? It's our first topic and our first question to discussion, and I think I will give floor first of all to Sarah, and then to Reza and Federico, if you're good with it.
Thank you. I think there's an image that I'd like to pull up. If that's possible.
Sorry?
I think there's an image that I asked to be pulled.
Okay, image. Okay.
Perhaps while you find it, I'll just say that in the pre-event discussion, we talked about the instrumentalization of myth. And I really agree with Reza that there needs to be more specificity about what we're talking about when we say myth. Perhaps in a very loose sense, in response to this question, the notion of a narrative, myth is narrative, that can have a transformative effect in the shared reality. And then to use another definition of myth as the kind of falsehood, the reality that we've been burdened with and is now clunking and glitching before our eyes is that there is this one stable reality, which is a consensus reality in which things make sense. And I think that's really falling apart now. So the image that I wanted to show actually was a photo of graffiti that was taken at some protests in Oakland, California, following the shooting of Jacob Blake, who is a 29-year-old Black man, by a police officer in Wisconsin. And this graffiti said, "No cops, no jails, no linear fucking time." And this was in the context of the huge wave of protests in defense of Black life last year, and the surrounding interest and activism around abolition and transformative justice. So there's an abolitionist and healer called Tiffany Lenoy who tells us abolition is non-linear. That's why we're able to change the present while living in the future now. So basically, to very briefly expand on abolition and TJ, where there's an instance of harm, abolitionists will reject a carceral justice model of the crime and punishment dyad, and instead actively seek to build new models of preventing and healing harm, such as community accountability processes. Here we go. So this is an example of creating new narratives and putting them into practice in the current order of things from a perspective where speculation and imagination are brought together with an emphasis on structural change. And it's also a method of time travel, a practice of embodying science fiction, which I think, I'd be interested to hear what you think about this, that in the current moment, I see science fiction as a place in which new mythologies are made by refusing these either or categories of myth or reality, by creating new worlds and spatiotemporal configurations in their place. But at the same time, it's not fantasy, which is completely rejecting and eliding the particular arc of technological modernity, which has made science and technology a reality. Thank you.
Thank you. Reza, do you have anything to add on this topic?
Yes, thank you so much, Sarah. Magnificent, as usual. So what I have here is that Federico can talk about this more than me. Really, I think that we need, first thing, we should get it right. Myth does not stand against reason. This is, at this point in philosophy, should be. Actually, myth-making is part of a theory of mind, right? So we have, one of the things that when we think about the old idea of commentaries about myth-making and myth always have had, in fact, a very uncanny, almost unhealthy relationship with the word, right? The word is really the origin of the world, right? You get this in the religious context of mythological, sagas, from Sumerians, from Egyptians, to Sennacherib of Neo-Assyrian Empire, Elamite, so on and so forth, Bible. So the word and the world, this sort of entanglement between word and the world, it's really the origin of myth. And that's also where it is, where we need to actually put our emphasis, as whether myth is against reason or not, whether myth is protological or anti-logical, right? I would say that it is more on the side of the former. It's a proto-logical. And that actually gives us a different form of idea of how we can go on and think about myth-making in our age as a world in which its logic is shrinking. We need to make a myth that can instantiate a world whose logic overcomes the logic of our own, the world in which we inhabit, right? So these are the certain kind of stuff that we need to pay attention to. But ultimately, I would say that this idea of that has been always at the center of the discussion and debates about myth, language, collective consciousness and subconscious, so on and so forth, it needs to be explored even further. The idea that the world is partially or completely constitute the world. And that's where basically the idea of myth comes from. If that is the case, really, as Cazirer and so many of the people have talked about, then if that is the case, if the world partially or completely constitute the world, then for us to understand the mechanisms of mythologization, myth-making, perhaps we should start to shed more light on the origin of the world, on the origin, not in the metaphysical sense, but in the function, in the global function of language, of how it works, right? As an organ of reality. Max Miller has this idea that with regard to myth, that myth ultimately is nothing, this is his quote, but the darkening shadow which language throws upon thought. It is mystifying. Indeed, this shadow should appear ever as in aura of its own light, should evolve a positive vitality and activity of its own, which tends to eclipse what we commonly call the immediate reality of things, so that even the wealth of empirical sensuous experience pales before it. So if really this is the case, that one of the things that we should do, and ultimately in this modern age, and we are talking about myth-making amidst the ruins of modernity, epistemological, ontological, metaphysical, historical, so on and so forth. If that is the case, one way to actually shed light on myth, its functions and mechanism and its origins, is to shed light on what gives its actual power, the word, language. And the thing is that we have disenchanted the world, but yet we have not disenchanted language far enough.
Thank you, Reza. And now I give the floor to Federico.
Yeah, and thank you, Reza and Sarah. Really very interesting. I would like to concentrate on one thing that I'm not entirely sure I share, which is the idea of myth-making. Also on the basis of what I was saying earlier, I don't believe that myths are made. Myths emerge from reality themselves. Mythologies are made, so discourses around the mythical emanation phenomenon of reality. But the mythic quality has to do with the revelation of reality itself. I'm thinking, for example, if you think about archaic religions, in Greece, for example, Apollo, Athena, they were revelations of reality itself, which were recognized by the Greeks and then mythologized in a way, like wrapped in a particular narrative. But in themselves, they came from the world. They didn't come from the mind. If you think about archaic mentality, for example, which is very little theoretical, doesn't have much theoretical depth, the archaic mind is much based on observation, on empirical observation of reality. Even the mythic figures have to do with empirical observations of reality, including Apollo and Athena. Now, I chose Apollo and Athena in particular in this case because both of them oversee rationality. They are the two gods of rationality in different way. Athena more in the projectual form, so to say. Apollo more in the protological form, so in setting the ground of order. And both of them, I think, were recognized mythically in that the archaic mind that was witnessing reality witnessed the emergence, the coming up of the logical rational discourse from something or out of something, or in contrast to something that was beyond it. This grotesque mixing of the two gave the form of Apollo and Athena that speak reason. So in this sense, myths are not made, they're recognized. Once again, like mathematics, it's not made, it's recognized. Mathematics doesn't have inventions, only has discoveries. I think the same is in terms of myths. So when we talk about a projectual quality about myths, I don't see them as tools in any possible way. I mean, and when we try to associate myths with projects, for example, political projects, I think we are talking about propaganda or about fantasies or about rhetoric. Interestingly, in ancient Greece, it was noted how the decline of mythical revelations coincided with the coming up of rhetorics. The two kind of philosophy took the place of Sophia. Rhetoric took the place of an awareness of myths. So the two things I think are separate. And first of all, I don't believe it's possible to make myths. And secondly, I think that they don't lend themselves in any way to a project as such. If we want to have a project around myths, I think the only possible project has to do with educating the hearing and the seeing to be recognizing within reality an aspect which is mythic in itself. That one I can see as a project around myths. Beyond that, I'm not sure. In a way, if you think about how Rilke talks about Orpheus, for example, and it says that Orpheus to his listeners created a temple inside their hearing. And that is, I think, the only type of possible project around myth making. Just a final comment about the practice of mythology today, as I've tried to describe it, the practice of relating to myths. In antiquity, and especially in archaic antiquity, used to take very public forms. So there was a collective awareness, so to say, like there was a collective performance of witnessing the revelation of the divine. In the contemporary world, because of different metaphysics, so because of a different understanding of what reality fundamentally is, there tends to be a more private experience of this thing. And so in that sense, the mythology, in the sense of talking about how reality reveals itself to us in this mythic form, tends to have more private forms. When it's pulled into the public, in the kind of political realm, there tends to be a misnomer when we talk about these things mythically.
Thank you. Thank you, Federico, and thank you all for sharing your ideas about myth making at the manifestation. And I actually have a question in this point of our discussion, question to all of you. I think we find like one of the important point of our discussion, the conflict between myth as something that invented actually, or myth as something that emerged. What's the difference in this point? May you like explain more clear what the difference between the myth, concept of myth as invention or creation of something, and of myth like emergence, as you, Federico, said. It's a question to all, probably. Reza, you want to start?
I want to start so that Federico actually utterly disseminates my answer. I liked that. I actually quite liked Federico's response. But I would say that, look, this is why we should distinguish different concepts of myths, and rather than abiding by one concept of myth and defending or attacking it, we have to distinguish various concepts of myths that have been going around, and people are been smuggling them. We have been smuggling them for too long. Myths, absolutely, they cannot, in their symbolic form, in their symbolic collective form, cannot be made, right? They are spontaneous, they cannot be made. But that doesn't mean that myths cannot be made. In a different concept of myth as vehicles, political myths, so on and so forth, vehicles of basically historical mobilizations, intentional historical mobilization by a specific people who have a certain kind of monopoly over certain kinds of myths. And we have seen it from, I don't think we should talk about Greek culture. Greek culture is an upstart culture when it comes to Sumerians, right? The Fertile Crescent. When we should talk about Akkadian and Sumerians. And absolutely, I would say that the myths, in a certain sense, have the spontaneity, come and coalesce regardless of ideologies. But then that's precisely because the conjunction, the entanglement between the world and the word and the world, myth and language, the people begin to start the salient and tacit elements of a particular myth, whether it's to their advantage or not. The greatest myth ever invented, Aryanism. And yet, it is the most bogus myth of all, right? It has been, so Achaemenid dynasty, and before even Achaemenid dynasty in Iran plateau, where Darius and Cyrus the Great call themselves of Aryan people. Yeah, Aryan people, really, we don't know anything about who these people are. Simply Aryan people at that point means people of what Schlegel would have called people of Ur language, of an original language, of some common language, simple as that. There is nothing more to it, right? But then we see the transition of this sort of myth making as a vehicle of political enterprise and political enforcement in a materialist sort of way during the Sassanid era against the Arabs, against anything the non-Persian, Romans, so to speak. I mean, all Romans, sorry, Federico, are basically of this sort of people, like they are non-Aryans, And this, then you see that the further mobilization of this sort of myth by people like Gobineau, right? The ultimate racist French, commentator on all of this. And then Schlegel, other kind of Germanic things, and then all of them come in a very critical moment in history. Aryanism, right? Which is completely actually very different from what Aryanism of Iran is, because Iran simply means Aryan Dakunam, the nest of Aryans. But so I would say that we need to be very careful about when we say that, well, not basically myth is not myth making, and myth is always collectively emanating from a certain kind of non-agentic groundwork. I think that they are both true, but I would say that going for the former, that myth it can never be mobilized politically, or can be mobilized, but myths cannot be made, I think risk the historical lessons that we have learned from the very people who have made or rather accentuated existing myths and mobilized it toward their ends. This is why I would say that myths are never neutral. Even though in their origins are neutral, as Kazirer would have said, interconnectedness at best, holes, making new holes out of this universe such that we can find our place in that. But I would say that myths absolutely not neutral, nor innocent. And we should not normalize that innocence for myths. It is a recipe for disaster.
Thank you, Reza. Sarah or Federica, do you have anything to add?
There's a lot to respond to. I agree that myths can be, so when I pointed to that image, I wasn't saying that it was an example of myth making, but more the way in which a dimension of myth that is otherwise more far away from us in our mundane daily lives, that such as time travel or an experience of time which is not clock time, that can be a window into imagining everything else differently. But then there are so many things to respond to, as I said. Firstly, the connection between the word and the world, which makes me think, what kind of word? Is it a written word? Is it phonetic, written in a phonetic alphabet? Is it written in a pictographic alphabet? Or is it spoken? If it's written and it's phonetic, then it is progressively more disembodied, which connects to perhaps an idea of enchantment, which I think that we should also dig into. But before I go there, just to respond to what Federico said and maybe try and kind of bring them together in some way, that do myths emerge or are they made? I think that there's something here which makes us, which demands that we think about, again, a philosophy of language. Are words animate? Do they have potency? Why should words be disenchanted further? And this thing about, I suppose, disembodiment and the way in which a certain kind of word or alphabet can precipitate that, like a kind of increasing logocentrism, which I suppose is something that we connect with the age of reason. But yes, so when we think about misenchanting reality or disenchanting them, I think we need to look at how we are understanding something as enchanted or not. So this is where the language comes in. So in our pre-chat, we talked about David Abrams and his work that puts sensuous embodied knowledge in relation to enchantment, which I roughly define as a sense that the world around you is living and in connection. And perhaps here it's better described or better referred to by speaking about its opposite. So I thought of Camus' Myth of Sisyphus when you were talking about reason, Reza, that in the Myth of Sisyphus, the human is confronted by the unreasonable silence of the world. And that is perhaps an example of modern disenchantment. So his book, The Spell of the Sensuous, is this kind of classic of ecological thinking about the encounter between the human and the non-human world. And it's trying to understand what it is about our perception that makes the world seem more or less enchanted. And so basically, to cut it short, a pictographic or an ideographic alphabet gives more of a window into the world, which is non-human and is animate and is alive. And that, for Abrams, gives a more enchanted sense of the world. So this idea of whether myths are made or whether they are already existing, perhaps it's a matter of attunement, as you say, Federico. I think that's what you said. And then this question of political mobilization. Yes, Aryanism is one very dangerous myth, as is patriarchy. But then the myth of patriarchy is the one that does divide language up into various forms of validity, basically, or just in a very kind of material sense, what we have as knowledge is passed down and reproduced in a particular way. And so oral traditions in which myths would have first been transmitted to carry various forms of knowledge no longer really exist among us.
Thank you. Federica, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting what both of you said, and I was fascinated in particular by the reference to Aryanism. It kind of started making me think in a way about the mythic quality of the question of the Aryans. In the way in which it is used, usually, I believe that the way in which Aryanism is utilized is usually a metonymy to mean us. So, for example, it's the Aryans are always us, it's never them. Whoever uses the trope of the Aryan always signifies the Aryans, comma, us, against them. Usually this is a typical thing that is done by many tribes when they call themselves the Alemanni, all the men, or when they call themselves Inuit, the humans. We are the humans, fundamentally. So the Aryans are the true humans, which means us. Now,
usually it's the noble humans.
Yeah,
noble
humans. Aryan etymologically means, or you could say in Greek, the virtuous, the one who has...
The virtuous, yes, absolutely.
Exactly, for the aristoi. But now, this experience of the us is in itself a mythic revelation. There is a revelation of the us, of the me, okay? So the experience of somehow feeling the identity of being something, being somebody that is specific and that is me, that I recognize as mine. This is a mythic experience in that you have a linguistic layer in which I can call us by name, me by name, and the ineffable experience of a darkness out of which this us emerges. Now, you can find this, for example, you can find this mythic experience of the us, of the being Aryan, developed in two different ways. And it depends how you mean us. If you mean us indexically, or if you mean us taxonomically. Indexicals are words like here and now. If I say it, my here is here, your here is there, and that's no problem. Indexical is like this pen. This pen is this pen. Whoever says it is an objective thing that stands by itself. Now, the religious way to say us, as in the mythic way, myths are part of religions. Let's not forget this. It's like sometimes we like talking about yoga as a sport. Myths have to do with religion. So the religious way of understanding the us, the revelation, is indexical, in the sense that the God of individuation, the Adam in monotheisms, for example, the first true human, is in us, acts through us, but is not reducible to us. So, for example, in ancient Greek mythology, whenever you act, is the god that acts through you. But you don't say it was fully me. I coincide with Athena that acted through me. So I'm the only taxonomical human there is here. It's Adam that is working through me. So you see, this is an indexical way. When you go taxonomical and it says, oh, us is just specifically us, and the God is not acting through me, but it's me. It's fundamentally, truly me, and only me. Okay, then you have blasphemy. This is blasphemy. And from blasphemy comes propaganda and politics as it uses mythology in that particular way, that kind of like full appropriation of the thing, of the myth. So in this case, I would still contend that, yes, it is true that there could be a blasphemous use of myths, in the sense that there is a blasphemous mythologization, so a blasphemous retelling of the myth in a way that can be completely twisted, but in itself it's like yoga being reduced to a sport. It is a problem, but it's not a problem with yoga itself. It's not a problem with myths themselves. It's a problem of bad practice. And in mythic language, you would say it's a problem of blasphemy.
Thank you, Federico. I think we may just, it's pretty interesting and serious topic that we may discuss like eternally, but we got a question from our chat that actually reflects the next question that I want to ask you. And reminder to our dear audience, if you want to ask a question, if it's possible, by the form near the stream, actually not below but left. So the question from Arseny, question about how we may develop everything what we speak about now to our everyday life, how the new myths is used or activated in real social life, because it's very important to explain how the form of old myths, new myth as an explanation, or myth as an political myth as a propaganda working in our social everyday life. And I want to add to these questions two important points from me. First point is how mythological thinking may resist the disintegration of reality on a global level. on level of everyday actions of our today world. And second point from me, it's about the urban legends and city mythology. How, from your opinion, it's actually work, and why the urban legends are so different from the previous myth. So it's like 3 questions, and 3 questions to all of you. Actually, probably somebody want to start? Sarah?
So may I interrupt? There's too many questions. I lost them.
First question. Yeah, 3 questions. First one about how we may dwell all theory on the practical level, how new myth working in our everyday life. Then second question about mythological thinking and resistance of disintegration of reality on the global and the local level. And third, actually, my own question about the modern urban legends, how they different from the old form of myth, why they actually exist, and how they work. So these 3 questions.
I think by going first, I'm going to try maybe one of those and then hand over. So, and I think that this relates to the previous block of discussion about whether myths are made or whether you can tune into them in some way. Because say that the great motorcycle trip, as Ursula Le Guin put it in one of her essays, I think it's a non-Euclidean view of California or something. She says that westernized modernity has been a big yang motorcycle trip as opposed to the paradox of what a yin utopia could be. And so against this kind of linearity and directionality, she proposes that side trips and reversals are precisely what minds stuck in forward gear most need. So there is not necessarily something about whether something is made or already exists, but maybe we can just step sideways and rethink, for example, not so in the mode of technological myth, but twist or flip what the myth of technology is. So in Ursula K. Le Guin's essay, The Carrier Bag Theory of Fiction, she explores the problem of technological mythology, which she calls the linear, progressive, times-killing arrow mode of the techno-heroic. And so she basically proposes an alternative theory of technology and the human development of tools. So instead of the big killing, stabbing hero, the phallic hero's weapon, she says that it's the humble container, the sack of oats, or the sling to carry the baby, or the shrine that holds whatever is sacred, as being the greatest invention of humans. And so it's striking to me that these are, domesticated, feminized tools of reproductive labor, and that leads me to this notion of everyday life and therefore narrative, and something about how narrative doesn't also have to be so linear and directional in everyday life. So the embeddedness of mythology is something that I think exists still in lots of different cultures other than westernized mythology, where, for example, the I Ching is at once a mystical divinatory tool that was based on esoteric knowledge of cosmic and mythic forces, but at the same time it was used for statecraft and questions of governance. And at the same time, the principles underlying the I Ching are inseparable from a practice of traditional medicine and also practices such as Qigong. And then also in Aboriginal Australia, or some, not to flatten it, but there are cosmogonic mythical songs, which are maps that carry knowledges of how to navigate vast areas of land, what is called the Labyrinth of invisible pathways, which meander all over Australia, and are known to Europeans as dreaming tracks or songlines, and to the Aboriginals as the footprints of the ancestors or the way of the law. So I think that this points back to the animacy of language, and that in some cosmologies, there's not such a strong distinction between animate and inanimate, and things can indexically be alive or not at any other time. So I guess, the thing about what the role of myths is in everyday life is that it's also a technology. If storytelling and songs are word-based technologies to carry knowledge and culture. And mythology is that in which the essences of words, such as gods and heroes and monsters, they take on their own independent lives. So that's a method that does allow for multiple realities to come together and be inhabited at the same time.
Thank you, Reza. Federico?
I can,
Reza.
sure. Thank you so much, Sarah. Great as usual. I think I want to say something before completely stopping to say anything, right? And giving the mic to Federico to finally end this session. I want to say that I don't feel comfortable with this sort of stuff. We're basically, there is what Sarah is describing is essentially the metaphoric origin of the myth, right? Where basically metaphor, as we know it, is an extremely potent device, technology, so to speak, and where basically language goes upstream to myth and myth goes downstream to language. And we borrow stuff from one another, from this side and from that side of the river, upstream and downstream, and we put it together. Otherwise, I wouldn't say that without this sort of considerations, which are fundamentally modern and critical, philosophical and theoretical considerations, I would say there wouldn't be any sort of use to hold on to things like magic or myth. It would be, as I mentioned, if there is actually a reason to keep the idea of myth, my apologies, Federico, myth-making, not in the sense that someone makes the myth, but myth-making as if there is a collectivity that goes into the constitution of the myth itself, right? Whether it is dark undercurrent or not. I would say that can only be, we can only say that we can basically preserve it if it allows us to move from the certain kind of unexamined dogmas that we have had as empirical facts to new facts of experience which can challenge what we deemed as empirical and as facts in the previous world. I think that myth at this point should only make that sort of function. A pincer assault on the old world, like Tenet movie, Christopher Nolan, moving forward in time and moving backward in time, from future to the past and past to the present, right? That we need to have something like that. Otherwise, whatever we are talking about, this sorts of stuff, I feel that we will eventually find ourselves in an extremely sordid intellectual atmosphere, politically and culturally so. But that doesn't mean that we have to inferiorize the role of myth. No. This means that we need to take the idea of myth seriously, but a myth that is completely updated to the sort of world, whether we like it or not, we are living. And this is a critical world. Last thing would be, I would say that literally any sort myth precisely by virtue of its metaphorical loadedness needs to be, as I said it earlier on, needs to be distinguished, needs to be decanted into different compartments of what it means in terms of symbolic form, in terms of its potency for political mobilization, so on and so forth. I feel extremely queasy to feel that we should just talk about no mythologies at this point without actually doing the groundwork. I would say that lacking the sort of groundwork that I think that some of us are actually interested in simply lead into another sort of this sort of charade of basically what I call zombie inclusivity. Basically, magic is fine, animism is fine, inanimism is fine, this is fine, this is that fine, this is fine. Yeah, look, yes, they all need to be fine. But in what sense? In the sense that yes, they can all be part of the proto-culture from which we have come. Well, we have to analyze them, and not all of them are on the same rankings. And I don't want this whole idea of Neomythology shetic to gain an ontological and metaphysical foothold. That would be complete disaster against the critical legacy from which we have come and to which we have a responsibility.
Thank you, Reza. Federico, your comment?
I think this conversation could last a very long time, also because we seem to be different viewpoints on many different aspects, of course, which have been beautifully put, each of them so far. But as I understand the question of myths, and of course, the first thing that I want to clarify here is that I think that there is a risk sometimes to have the attitude of the last man, as you see in Nietzsche's Zarathustra, the one that walks through the museum of the world and picks a bit of animism here, a bit of that there because it looks nice with my couch, you know, like that, kind of like picking and choosing from the shopping center. Myths are not that stuff. Myths are not that kind of stuff. Like religions are not that kind of stuff. Myths are revelations. Okay, they are revelations, and thus they don't, like, although they come from outside, in a sense, they are imbued within reality, is a way of reality to reveal themselves. They are not contained, they cannot be fetishized, they cannot be reified, you cannot put them into an object and then you consume that revelation. The revelation happens individually to a single person, in the way the revelations do. It's a bit like love. One thing is experiencing it, and one thing is consuming it into an object. The two are entirely different things. What kind of revelation are they? They're the revelation that reality is multidimensional. So the revelation, and this is, by the way, this is to respond to the first question, what can we do in practice with myths? The revelation that reality is multidimensional, that there is a level of language, the level of rationality, they're all true and legitimate. There are other levels as well, and they coexist in a coincidence of opposites that coexists. Okay, so all the different registers are legitimate, but none of them can reclaim the totality of the discourse. Now, what does this do in practice if you have this revelation? It gives you freedom. Freedom because basically it allows you to no longer identify with any particular layer to which other people usually classify you with, and freedom from the superstitious belief that the one layer of reality, for example, in contemporary world, the layer of language, which is the main, the only one, that is the totality of things. And so if you fail in that one, if you disappear in that one, you've really disappeared. And so freedom from the blackmail of that particular blackmail. Now, how do you get to this kind of freedom? How do you get to the revelation? By paying attention, fundamentally, by paying attention to all the different, to the co-presence of things, to the blind spots within discourses, and realizing already what people call sometimes today the glitch, but the glitch as the ulterior, the beyond, which doesn't deny the entire discourse, but simply hints to the fact that beyond the discourse, there is something that is outside of all discourses. This is all very nice. However, the problem is how you get there. It's easy to say, just pay attention to things. Yes, but how do people usually pay attention to things? How do revelations usually happen? If you look at, for example, mystical literature, you see that the first step to achieve a revelation is desocialization. Desocialization is, as Christ says in the gospel, you have no longer mother and father, husband and wife or children. So basically you extract yourself from your social roles. You disidentify with your social roles. You get out of the being swallowed of the whirlwind of society and of the particular layer. How do you achieve that? How do you desocialize today? And this is actually the only practice that you can truly do at this point. In order to get to the practice at the end, how it makes your life better, you have to go all the way back. And the starting point at the moment is rendering possible to desocialize. How do you do that? First thing first, fighting against work, for example. Fighting against the regime of work is the first step, I believe, to reopen the channel of a possible revelation. Fighting against the regime of nationalities, that's another one. Fighting against a particular understanding of the economy that tries to reify everything and substitute its own abstract values to everything. Political work in itself, I see as conductive to mythological revelation, even though the two are entirely separate. It's a groundwork. Now, about the disintegration of reality, and I'll try to be as fast as I can. About the disintegration of reality, well, the one thing that was interesting that I found in one of the comments by Reza was about what we leave to the next world. And I'm also very fascinated by the idea of leaving ruins. And I also agree that worlds don't usually come up anew. One of the horrible things that were told in Christianity was Tertullian, an early Christian, that used to say, we are so new, we will eradicate your old world of the gods, everything will be anew. Now that is, Tertullian was a Trumpist, fundamentally, a Trumpist of late antiquity. And I also believe there is a continuity between worlds. The difficulty is that we don't know what remains in the next world. We need to leave something, and we know that something will remain, we don't know what. Usually based on experience, what remains is chosen by them, not by us, and misunderstood and reappropriated. So I think to the best of our abilities, one good thing would be to leave to the next world a certain education of the gaze that allows them to have that freedom. So like the understanding of reality as multi-layered, in which no particular layer can advocate the whole, the absolute to itself. And to conclude, the urban legends, well, urban legends are fantasies, okay? So they're not myths, they are fantasies. They are interesting to the extent to which they reveal a lack. They reveal, there are compensatory forms. You know, like there is a lack for a feeling of, there's a lack of meaning, fundamentally. There is a lack of meaning in reality itself. Reality is so perfectly closed today, enclosed within language, that the one thing is missing. When language is entirely closed, is full, there is one thing missing: meaning. If you think of a dictionary, the one thing that is missing is within a dictionary is sense. And so there is this feeling of a lack of something else, some other thing where meaning might lie. And so you invent these fantasies about God knows what, and the conspiracy theories and all that kind of stuff. These are symptoms of a lack. In reality, of course, meaning comes from outside of language. By definition, it is the non-linguistic, the voice is the gaping hole of the throat through which the voice emerges that is irreducible to the voice. So in that sense, urban legends as fantasies signal, however, to an interest. The problem is that this interest, without the conditions for desocialization that allow for the paying attention, that allows for the revelation and thus for the freedom, you know, like it will not be fulfilled.
Thank you. We actually, before we start speaking about the traces that we actually leave from modern mythmaking, the traces we leave to our next generations, which Federica actually started before, I want to ask two questions from our audience. They are pretty connected. They're pretty connected with each other. First question is about how modern myth works as a with new mediums, because like the previous myths, the ancient one or the myth before the 20th century was passed by voice and not written down or recorded, most of all. And now we have myth, we have internet. Internet posts may become a myth or may become a viral meme, something else. Do actually internet created some myths. And the second point, it's pretty connected to the idea of internet or globalization or interconnection with each other. It's actually can we reflect on a connection between mythology and gender equality, for instance, projects like Me Too and so on, that actually made it possible by these new mediums. So the question of myth and new mediums, and the developed questions of myth and new medium is the phenomena of Me Too, and how myth may help or may not help actually to achieve a gender equality. So it's two questions from our audience. And actually we have like lots of good and interesting questions, but we have not so much time. Yeah. So probably anyone want to start it?
I'll say something very quickly about the internet question, which is that I think a lot of this thing about memes and whatnot can be, I'll just refer back to Federico's answer about something that is more about a lack and signifying a lack. But what I do find interesting, not about Web 2.0, which is this hell of just shortening, tightening, more constraints on the ways in which we can talk to each other. It is what Federico might describe as the, like the kind of ongoing hell of capture by language, that's social media. But what's maybe more interesting is the internet that is coming, in which new configurations or emerging configurations of our own social formations interacting with new technologies such as VR, AR, and continuously existing metaverses. What's interesting there is that to see what forms of narrative are produced, which are non-linear, they're immersive and they're participatory. And so there could be new forms of communality and collective narrative making, which, it's basically different ways of being present together to share and to create and to hold and to swap knowledges that I think can open up maybe new ways of thinking about the trace in itself.
Thank you. Probably Federica, you want to something to add?
Yeah, I don't want to take always the last position, which is the easiest, so you're responsible. Interesting questions, and like I'm not a technologist, so I cannot comment with maybe with sufficient understanding. But it seems to me that the question regarding the new medium is a question not so much about myths; it's a question about mythology. The difference, of course, being the myth are in reality. Mythology is the discourse around the revelation in reality. So it's a mode of distribution of the mythology. So how this revelation, once it is put down into a narrative form, then it is distributed. Now, this is fantastic, but the problem of distribution is that if you have nothing to distribute, so it's like those enormous highways when they are completely empty, because there was like a ghost town. It's an entire ghost town in which there's nothing actually to populate it. So the problem, I think, is not so much the potentiality of this distribution network, is what do you actually distribute in it? And if, according to, in my particular case, to my own understanding of what a myth fundamentally is, I see that we have these enormous highways and nothing to make run through them, except propaganda, rhetorics, fantasies, and all that kind of stuff, which has nothing to do with this, of course. About the question of gender, I remain skeptical about the possibility, of course, of using myths projectually, so in terms of, as part of a project, to use them as tools. However, it does have an impact. I think a mythic revelation does have an impact in terms of understanding of gender, not so much in a political sense of, I believe that it's politics that leads to myths, not myths that lead to politics. So the good ordering of the life leads to a good understanding, and not the other way around. But in the sense of a mythic revelation and gender, well, it leads you to an indexical understanding of gender once again. So like not understanding it taxonomically as like this is a woman, this is a man, and so on and so forth, but to a transcending of genders in that particular form. So not so much in terms of gender equality, more in terms of transgenderism and queering of genders. In that case, yeah, probably yes. As a side effect, not as an intended necessary effect, and I don't think it should be used for that, but as a side effect, it does have that. So that you can be accompanied by the god or the goddess, as in you can be inhabited by masculinity and femininity in a way that is not, that you don't own masculinity or you don't own femininity, you don't coincide with it. We were talking about it a moment ago. So this is how I think it relates to gender in particular. The political struggle, I think, is a separate thing, and it probably comes first, but it's separate.
Thank you, Federica. Reza, do you have anything to add?
Nothing much. I would say that, well, I mean, obviously from a communist perspective, when you say that, oh, the technologies of distributions basically are seized by whom, right? So, I mean, a good example of this in terms of the kind of mobilization of mythologies, right? The discourse around mythologies is very much like Netflix. Look, so we have great film directors in the golden age of Hollywood, but basically more or less they're independent. Yes, sure, they are under the constraints of the producer and so forth, right? Producers are different from distributors, right? They can negotiate with you. And they have always been doing that, even for the worst. But the thing is that we have arrived in an age of cinematography, of film industry, where the goddamn distributors are both the producers and the guys who hire directors. That is a recipe for disaster. Distributors should always be seized by the collective. Communist 101. The moment that the channel of distribution is seized by something other than the collective, I would say that it results something like Netflix mythology of culture, if I may say so, right? An extremely sordid liberal American mythology for the white left, for them to feel good about themselves after all these years? Absolutely, under my goddamn dead body. Now, coming back to the idea of lack, I wouldn't call this a lack. Of course, Federico and I can go after this. I wish he was here so we could share this on and Sarah as well. Beer, wine, whiskey, going through that. I wouldn't call this really a lack. I would say myth as carrying a very special form of ignorance. Why do I call it ignorance? You see, ignorance is usually, in an epistemological sense, supposed to be neutral, negative, meaning it doesn't know anything about the facts. Its attitude toward empirical facts or truth is neutral, simply ignorant of them, right? It's negative. But myth has something quite vibrant about this, about its own sort of ignorance, which is not really a lack of misunderstanding or ununderstanding of empirical facts and rational truths. It's actually get excited by its own ignorance, such that that sort of excitement allows it to mobilize it toward a certain form of ignorance mitigation down the line, rather than truth discovery, ignorance mitigation. And ignorance mitigation is the fundament of what you might call to be rational enterprise. So to really distill and decant that ignorance mitigating power of myth, that sort of weird excitement about the sort of ignorance that I have and I can mitigate it, is, I think, something that should be preserved, accentuated, and yes, in left accelerationist sense, accelerated.
Thank you all. And we actually have one last question, which Federica started to answer before. It's a question which make the line after our discussions, the final conclusion of it. Which traces we will at the modernity remain for myth-making for the next generation, which actually we may remain for them? And it's a question for all of us, and probably which myth they may create on the material that we actually made, or which myth may emerge from this material that we leave. Federica, maybe we started with you, because you actually started to speak about this before.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, when talking about what will remain of modern myth-making, my first reaction, of course, is to say there is no such thing. So not very much. The content is missing. If we're talking about what remains of modern fantasies, then nothing by definition, because fantasies disintegrate, and modern propaganda also very little, because propaganda becomes immediately obsolete as soon as the historical context changes, like satire. So in that sense, of all that kind of stuff that is usually associated with modernity and myth, so the myths about modernity or the myths produced by modernity, that stuff, I say it's not mythical in any way, it's fantasy and propaganda, none of it will remain. Something else probably will remain. So some aspects of what Reza was defining also as the critical engagement with things, some of these aspects, of course, will remain. They don't fall into the mythic realm as such. They are discourses. So in a sense, they are the development of particular discourses within the rules of the discourse itself. And in that instrumental sense, so like logic, for example, in the way in which it operates is an instrument, they will remain as instruments and so as infrastructures. Usually, I have to say, when we look at the collapse of civilizations, infrastructures are the first thing that usually goes. So the chances are that probably of that, not much will remain, but not because it's not worthy, but simply because it tends to be the first thing that goes. Now, if we were thinking about something that might somehow support them, and support the survival of these infrastructures, such as criticism, such as logics, as we understand it, such as the scientific discourse, is grounding. It's a good way to ground infrastructures into something outside of them. If we look at the collapse of civilizations, once again, the usual way in which things were survived is if they were grounded into a sacred realm. So usually a sacred artifacts tended to survive better, even if they had an infrastructural necessity, even when they were misunderstood. They were misunderstood to be somehow sacred, that they tend to be preserved for misunderstanding. How do we ground these epistemological fields? Well, we have to ground them with something that is outside of them. Of course, that grounds them by definition. So we have to operate on the limits of them. So we have to work around the limits of logics, around the limits of criticism, around the limits of knowledge. What is there around the limits of knowledge? There is specifically what Nicholas of Cusa, a Renaissance philosopher, called the docta ignorantia, of learned ignorance. And here is exactly when we're talking about myth once again. Working on the idea of ignorance is fundamental to be able to preserve the discourses, because it grounds them, because it gives them a shape and a limit. Now, how do you work around the idea of ignorance in a way that is not superstitious? So denying that you have superstition is denying that you are ignorant. It's affirming that you know everything. Okay, this is what superstition by definition is. But also that in a way that is not entirely silent and says we know absolutely nothing. Is that in between? Working on attuning one's own hearing and seeing to the mythic revelation, I think, paradoxically, can ground rational discourses because it operates around their limits by giving some form of connection, like a bridge between what is said within the discourse and what is excluded from the discourse, in a way that doesn't say, since there is something outside of the discourse, then the discourse is false. But say the discourse as a whole, in which there is a hook that hooks it to something else, that act of hooking is the mythic revelation. And this, I think, sets the foundation on the one hand for the survival of the critical discourse, and on the other hand, also for a non-superstitious discourse. Now, thinking about ruins, this interesting cooperation between people that work within the discourse and people that work around the limits of the discourse, at the moment is kind of lacking in the sense that there is either the old opposition between rationality and irrationality. Okay, that's the old school opposition, or, which is even worse, a pseudo mishmash of rationality and irrationality without really understanding what we're talking about. And it is like that form of fantasy, okay, that kind of like the fantastical element that is sold as dealing with the outside of the rational. And so like the scientist has this kind of like fantastical dreams, a bit weird, and that it's like somehow mythological to them. And then like they think that by dealing with these fantasies, Elon Musk is a typical example of this, by dealing with these fantasies, they are tapping into the unknown. Okay, this is, first of all, it's bullshit, but also it doesn't in any way help to preserve that particular discourse. It discredits it entirely. And it discredits it entirely, especially to the eyes of somebody in the next world, as in the next configuration of sense, who will have no particular sympathy for what is old. To them, we will be old. And by saying we will be old, we will be as old as Gilgamesh. We will be as old as the ancient Greeks, as old as the Aztecs. To the present, the past is all equally old, okay? And this way of mishmashing just will make it look like a fraud always and entirely in the first place. So I believe in like a good old scholastic of the Middle Ages. I believe in an orderly kind of a cooperation of the religious and the scientific work.
Thank you, Federica. Sarah.
The question was which traces will remain of modern myth-making. I mean, I'm going to keep this brief because we have 1 minute and there are whole vistas that we have not touched upon together, including, you know, what is an archetype, these things. And so I guess what remains, I think Federico's definition of myth as revelation and essentially a Gnostic experience is something that takes place within the body. And the reason I keep going on about the body is because, you know, I thought, oh, I'm going to be talking with 3 philosophers. I'll reach for Sadie Plant, who said that, you know, this flight from the body is the greatest trick of Western patriarchy, going back to Socrates. And yeah, it's in the body in which gnosis happens, but also where perhaps some of this groundwork is happening. The withdrawal of senses and desocialization is #1 in the practice of yoga. And that is, again, something that cultivates the body, which is also a microcosm of the bigger cosmos. And so when, for example, external infrastructure is falling apart, what kind of spiritual infrastructure do we have that could perhaps last and carry over into the next world, or what traces will remain? And then finally, just quickly to mention that epigenetically, we also do pass on the material trace of things that happen mythically, perhaps.
Thank you. And Reza, your final statement.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Two things. One, I think that what will remain? I would say that this question asks us too much and actually compels us to commit the sin of bunching the stuff together without any sort of critical discrimination. I would say that for me, any sort of myth, as I said it on at the beginning, needs to be within the continuation of the Enlightenment project. And within that Enlightenment project, as I have tried to say, that I'm not really a proponent of a sort of kind of like Enlightenment project where basically reason is always in a clash with unreason and this sorts of stuff that you get in the earlier on romanticism of the project of enlightenment. No, but what I would want to say that essentially three words that are important to me: humanity, history, and reason. In the sense that reason should always underline the limitations, self-imposed limitations of the human. And in doing so, also underlines and highlights the self-imposed limitations within the edifice of myth. But that is not actually happening within the edifice of myth. We cannot talk about how myth functions, what can remain of it, how we can go on about it, so on and so forth, unless and until we have inhabited a position which is peculiarly that of enlightenment, a critical position, so to speak. Right? Enlightenment here, understand that I am not endorsing white dude sort of enlightenment. After all, I'm a Middle Easterner. I think that there are sorts of alternative histories of enlightenment. So this is why I'm talking about that. That sort of enlightenment, the core of enlightenment, would be how we can make narrations about our limitations and our obstacles within this age, here and now, critically understood. Obviously, that sort of question does not, at least on the paper, does not lend itself to the organon of myth. But nevertheless, I think that a narrative can come out of that. A potent narrative can come out of that, in the sense that how modernity, how rationality, how reason in a collective sense can learn its own limitation and obstacles. And in that, it can coincide with the ultimate truth of myth, that every myth that has come and been supplanted by another one has been spontaneously taken root from the edifice of myth itself. That myth ultimately is the concrete overcoming of its own dogmas, of its own ignorance, right? As I mentioned, it's a very special, excited, collective and necessary form of ignorance, especially in the sense that it can mitigate itself. And ultimately, when we look into the age of reason, if there is such a thing, rationality, and with that, the concepts, fundamental concepts of personhood, agency, humanity, so on and so forth, should also adopt this sort of attitude, that we are not gaining knowledge, essentially, even though we do, but it's not the main focus of modernity. That it's not, we are not gaining knowledge about who we are. Essentially, we are shedding our ignorance. We are mitigating our ignorance. That the idea of myth, and with that, modernity, ultimately, as the formal realization, formal and conscious realization of the mechanisms that went into myth, is the great age of unlearning. Unlearning slavery, unlearning biases, unlearning dogmas. Rather than learning, rather than this whole idea of that accumulating facts. The great age of unlearning is yet to come. I think that that is the myth, that we need to create narratives for it by any means possible. Whether we have to invent gods or necromantize, bring old elder gods back in the shapes of the humans, as ancient Eastern religions have always been doing, right? You know, the greatest way to show that all gods are death is by practically showing it. And what is that sort of practice? By you becoming God itself. But not as objects of religion, but as objects of philosophy.
Thank you, Reza, and thank all of you to come today and to have such interesting and pretty difficult discussion, because we have very important and close to our everyday life topics, which actually have very different points of view. And me personally will think this night and probably the next night about these discussions and the conclusions, the idea that actually starting to grow in me. So I think it was pretty interesting and pretty important discussion. Thank you all for coming, and thank audience to being with us. And I personally want to thank the organizers teams of New Now project, and now give a floor to Anna.
Thank you all very much. Right, so I guess I'm just gonna sum it up in a few words. Thank you, Alexander, for beautifully putting this conversation together. Thank you to all of the three speakers, really very interesting and out of the box conversation, and three interpretations of contemporary mythologies, of Neomythologies. It's been really interesting. Reza Negarestani, author and philosopher, Sarah Shin, publisher, curator, writer, and Federico Campagna, author and philosopher. Thank you very much again. And I personally look very much forward to actually re-watching and re-listening to this discussion once again. I would like to remind our audiences that on the program website, the video of this discussion will appear in just a couple of days, so you will be able to re-watch it once again. And also a reminder to our audiences that also on the website you will find a list of carefully selected supplemental materials to this discussion that could help you in your self-guided immersion into the topic of today. So please all tune to www.newnow.com and stay tuned to our news. And coming next Basically, in several weeks, we're going to have a second session, second discussion of the new now program, which is going to be based around the theme of mental health and will take place on October 14th. Again, please stay tuned and see you all online. Thank you very much.